For the past couple of years, the one headline that has overtaken every breaking news bulletin across the world is the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia. This unprecedented event of the 21st century has raised an existential question in all our minds: whether a conflict between these two prosperous nations could trigger a third world war. However, this isn't the first time such alarms have been raised. There was one more instance when people worldwide were forced to anticipate a potential third world war. Also known as the tensest conflict in the history of modern geopolitics, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 pushed the world to the brink as the two reigning global superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States of America, faced off for 13 nerve-wracking days, while the rest of the world waited for the situation to cool down in sheer horror and with bated breath. Those 13 days had set the two most powerful nations and their leaders on the warpath, which, if not controlled, was sure to consume the world in its destructive wake. But what were the reasons behind the Cuban Missile Crisis? What roles did the then leaders of the two nations involved, John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, and Nikita Khrushchev, the president of what was then the Soviet Union, play through the situation? What were the consequences of this near-disastrous conflict? In this fascinating series, we will cover incidents that ultimately led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, while also exploring the historical equations and frictions in the race for global supremacy between the United States and the Soviet Union. Stay tuned to find out many fascinating facts as we unravel the secrets of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the 1960s, certain political developments led to a dangerous global situation, triggering off an event that could have ended the world as a consequence of a potential nuclear conflict between the two reigning superpowers. Even today, when we remember the events that led up to this situation, we shudder to think of the devastating consequences if a war had broken out between these two adversaries. Such was the threat that the Cuban Missile Crisis brought upon the modern world. The more significant conflict in general led to a face-off between the USA and the Soviet Union. Never before had two global giants directly challenged each other's dominance over the world. One could say that the showdown, or the 13 days, was the direct result of a nuclear arms race between the two nations. But there were also calculations and miscalculations, no less, on both sides that ultimately played a huge part in escalating the threat perception for both the players. At the center of this dramatic conflict were the White House and the Kremlin, where there was a complete lack of dialogue and exchange of information between the two. An inalienable tool of international political diplomacy, the lack of interaction between the two created fever-pitch tensions. In October 1962, the Soviets started shipping nuclear weapons to Cuba, an island just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. In response, John F. Kennedy launched a naval blockade around the island, leading to a stalemate. The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union had always been one of distrust since before the Second World War. So, let's look at this equation as it was then, because the Cuban Missile Crisis was a consequence of escalating tensions between the two nations. It was only through international pressure and tough, secret negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev that the Soviets finally agreed to disarm Cuba. Tensions prior to World War II. As an aftermath of the Soviet October Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin, the country descended into the Russian Civil War, which would last until 1923 and ultimately lead to the creation of the Soviet Union in late 1922. Contrary to the Marxist-Leninist communism that had fueled this agitation against the Western threat of capitalism, the Allies, on the other hand, saw it as a totalitarian coup and got the license to strengthen their defenses on their Western fronts. With the Soviet threat looming large over Europe, the existing Triple Alliance between France, Great Britain, and Russia broke, and the new Soviet regime was termed a traitor. Meanwhile, American President Woodrow Wilson's staunch opposition to the Soviet Union's supposed human rights violation and the new regime's command economy, which had given control of trade and prices to the central government, was mounting pressure on the already tense relations. Woodrow's main worry was spreading the Marxist-Leninist ideology into the Western world. In a bid to undermine Russian Central Power's will to continue and to inspire the Allies to victory, he delivered a speech on the 18th of January 1918 where he directly addressed what he perceived as the causes of the First World War by calling for the abolition of secret treaties, a reduction in armaments, an adjustment in colonial claims in the interests of both native peoples and colonists, and freedom of the seas. Wilson also made proposals that would ensure world peace in the future. He believed that the new nation would usher in a progressive and free social structure with the end of the Russian Revolution. He also advocated non-interference. However, he also pressed that Soviet Polish territory must be ceded to Poland, a newly created independent nation. Wilson had many opposers, like Henry Cabot Lodge, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. The latter pressed for the creation of an independent state of Ukraine. Apart from this, as Japan began to flex its muscles on its eastern international waters bordering Russia, triggering off yet another expansion in the Eastern Hemisphere, the United States, taking into consideration the Czech military support to Japan, decided to cut its presence in northern Russia and Siberia, while indirectly providing rations and essentials for the White Army. American famine relief. The 1917 Bolshevik Revolution resulted in a civil war that crippled southeastern Russia with a chronic food deficit. A drought had devastated the land and rendered it infertile. By 1920, the regions in the Volga, like Crimea, Ukraine, and Armenia, were facing famine on a biblical scale. The situation was so desperate that at the beginning of that same year, the Soviet government, in a bid to rescue millions from malnutrition and death from starvation, appealed to the world community for international aid. In response, the United States and nations in Europe organized relief programs, but soon realized the scale of this humanitarian crisis, which had the lives of some 20 million people or more on the line. The United States had not yet recognized the new Soviet government, but had been pressed to intervene in many of its issues by then. In the midst of this ongoing situation, in a bid to flag off relief programs, an unofficial dialogue between the two nations was initiated in 1920. By 1921, American President Warren Harding appointed Herbert Hoover to oversee the relief efforts. The American Relief Administration followed up by sending relief packages to the affected Russian regions, because of which the communist populace had begun to show a lot more confidence in their Western counterpart. America was also lauded globally for its Samaritan efforts. In the decade between 1920 and 1930, the relations between the United States and Soviet Russia had improved, so much so that in the Second World War, they also teamed up as allies to fight off The aftermath of the Second World War ushered in a period of increasing hostilities between the United States and Soviet Russia. The Americans staunchly opposed Stalin's invasion of Northern Europe, and this resulted in a head-on clash between opposing ideologies of communism and capitalism, dictatorship and democracy, which pitted the two nations directly against one another. The two superpowers had diplomatic ties that were governed through a complicated web of ideology, political, and economic factors. Because of this, both nations, with a history of long-standing discord, exercised cautious cooperation. This would keep shifting through their superpower rivalry, mainly because of the almost polar opposite systems that were very tough to negotiate and posed a challenge for both nations to come to common terms. Even in the Cuban Missile Crisis, this very schism between the two systems ultimately brought them to the brink of nuclear war. After Russia's exit from the First World War, the government of the United States was staunchly critical of its leaders, mainly because they were against any system or leader that supported communist ideology or propagated it. American traders between 1921 and 1929 established new economic policies. Still, it was not until 1933 that diplomatic channels were opened between the USA and Soviet Russia. Until then, Stalin's opposing critique of democracy created further differences between the center and the western regions, threatening to open up a powder keg of problems for the regime. Further adding to the mounting opposition on both sides, Soviet Russia's non-democratic and particularly aggressive stance towards Northern Europe hurled the rivalry to the point of no return. It's interesting to observe that these two nations had allied to beat Nazi Germany in the Second World War. For the next 3 decades, Russia and the United States ran the gauntlet to achieve military and nuclear supremacy. By 1970, Russia extended talks with the Western world to push peace and progress, cooperation, and economic growth, along with offers of disarmament. However, its stance on human rights and its invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 set back its vital negotiations with the Americans for good. Becoming Superpowers, USA, Bretton Woods Conference. The meteoric rise of the United States as an economic powerhouse had grabbed the attention of the world before the Second World War. Between the 1st and the 22nd of July, 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference, formerly known as the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, was held in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, United States, to regulate the international monetary and financial order after the end of the Second World War, and was attended by 44 allied nations, establishing the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. This led to the Bretton Woods System for International Commercial and Financial Relations, the headquarters of both of which were set up in Washington, D.C. The focal point of these global conventions was mainly to achieve adjustable foreign exchange rates that were pegged to gold and a pledge to make their currencies convertible for trade-related and other current account transactions. The United States had the biggest reserves of gold during the period, and the U.S. dollar had emerged as the new bankable currency in international trade and commerce. After the Second World War, the United States vied to take the podium as a global leader and representative. A huge step towards achieving this goal was the creation of the United Nations, which came into existence in 1945. A charter was drawn at the San Francisco Conference, where 50 nations voted for creating a regulatory body that would oversee future steps to avert another world war. Poland, too, signed the charter after a delay, bringing the majority to 51. With the consent and approval of the majority, the United Nations was officially formed on the 24th of October, 1945. Marshall Plan. After the Second World War ended, which resulted in the destruction of much of Europe, the United States played a significant role in the redevelopment and reconstruction of the infrastructure of its affected regions. Breaking from their usually aloof participation, American leaders chalked out a European recovery plan under which close to $13 billion were invested towards the relief efforts. The goals of the United States through this initiative were to rebuild war-torn regions, remove trade barriers, modernize industry, improve European prosperity, and prevent the spread of communism. This proved to be a game changer for the United States, and it helped it emerge as an economic and military superpower, ushering in a new world order. USSR. While the United States emerged as a global superpower after the Second World War, Soviet Russia quickly caught up to the race. Its armies had taken over almost the entire region of Northern Europe and signed a non-violence agreement with Nazi Germany. This helped them annex huge swaths of territory, but this would come at a huge price. The human cost for Russia in the Second World War was horrific. Not only did it pay with the lives of 20 million soldiers and civilians, which was the greatest humanitarian loss for a military nation, but the added destruction of its regions was only more damaging. That had a huge psychological impact on the nation, its leaders, and its citizens. As a result, the Soviet Union began to expand its influence over Northern Europe, annexing the neighboring regions of Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia, barring just Greece and occupied Austria. The Baltic nations like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were also annexed into Russia. Not even Finland was spared, as it was partially annexed. Russian influence was also quickly beginning to be seen in Asia, when in 1945, Mongolia became The Second World War was fought as much off the field as it was fought on it, and getting the edge over the enemy through information warfare was crucial for gaining vital ground over the enemy. This is where the secret services of nearly every nation involved in the war were put into action. Each country had its organization that would deliver tactical and strategic clues and information on troop movements, supplies, bunker locations, and armories. It will not be wrong to say that a chunk of the credit for the success of the victory of the alliance between the USA and the USSR goes to these secret agencies. With the end of the war, both the USA and the USSR hurled themselves into a race for supremacy and superpower status. They were relentless in equipping themselves to achieve this goal at any cost. This was the time when even the secret agencies on both sides got deeply involved in espionage against one another. The American Central Intelligence Agency and the Russian KGB, or the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti, exhibited exemplary skills in pushing their national interests. CIA. Created on the 26th of July, 1947, the Central Intelligence Agency is a civilian foreign services organization. The success of the British commandos during World War II prompted U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt to authorize the creation of an intelligence service modeled after the British Secret Intelligence Service MI6. This led to the creation of the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, which lasted only a few months. A restructuring proposal was drafted, implementing directives for the creation of what would become the Central Intelligence Agency. Despite opposition from the military establishment, the United States Department of State and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, President Truman established the National Intelligence Authority in January of 1946. Its operational extension was the Central Intelligence Group, or CIG, the direct predecessor of the CIA. In fact, did you know that prior to 1942, the United States ranked the lowest in terms of intelligence gathering? Civilian foreign intelligence services were non-existent then, and because of a lack of coordination between the armed and the naval forces, vital information was also often lost, posing a threat to national security. It was William J. Donovan who had planted a kernel of this idea, and after the formation of the OSS, Roosevelt appointed him as the chief. Donovan played a vital role in the structuring, operations, and strategy behind the formation of this agency. During the Second World War, the OSS had some 12,000 operatives secretly functioning across Nazi Germany and in occupied territories like Berlin and Europe, where the agency worked tirelessly to gather intelligence that ultimately helped the key policy and decision-makers a great deal in turning the tables on the field and proved to be highly beneficial to U.S. interests. After the passing of the National Security Act bill, the CIA was officially formed at the cusp of the Cold War with the USSR. It debuted with foreign intelligence operations, giving it the authority to consult and guide the government on security issues pertinent to Allied interests, specifically to check or potentially sabotage the expansion of Russia in the Eastern European theater. However, the CIA initially saw multiple setbacks, the prime reason for which was its Russian counterintelligence agency, the KGB, which seemed to always be one step ahead of the CIA. KGB. In the decade between 1920 and 1930, the Soviet Union put into action its military-governed secret services like the GRU, or Glavnoy Razvedenie Talanoy Upravlenie, NKVD, Narodnoy Commissariat Vnutrenih Del, and the KGB, that worked with American communists to undertake espionage and information gathering while also training spies for the operations. In America, Soviet spycraft fast evolved during the Cold War, implementing tactical and strategic missions, of which nuclear espionage was also a major part. The myths, legends, and stories leaked into the public domain also later formed a part of pop culture in the literary works of James Bond and Matt Helm. Operating during a period of relative technical limitations compared to today's standards, nations, instead of relying on risky electronic sources of communication, were utterly dependent on their spies operating in the field, who would usually disguise themselves and hide in plain sight while undertaking missions. Prior to the Cold War, the Soviets had begun spying operations that only picked up pace through the following decade of the 1930s. Operations usually involved decoding encrypted information and other ingenious ways to gather vital information. The KGB was formed to check national security threats and was actively involved in foreign intelligence gathering and sabotage through the 20th century. The agency had its name changed many times since the 1917 revolution, but its name remained unchanged for 46 years between 1954 and 1991. Initially formed as a political policing unit as part of the Soviet political interweb, the KGB officially began its operations under another agency called Cheka. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Secret Service and its directives were split between various smaller organizations. Beginnings. In 1880, Tsar Alexander II formed what was called Okhrana, a state police department that engaged in the role of Cuba in the Cold War. Throughout the Cold War's development, Cuba played a significant role in the events leading up to the missile crisis on its home turf. With its proximity to the American mainland, which was located just 90 miles off its shores, the island nation became a critical Soviet ally in the conflict between the two reigning superpowers. Apart from the missile crisis, Cuba also played vital roles in conflicts across the globe, as in the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion and the offshore disputes in Africa like the Angolan Civil War. In 1959, the president of Cuba, Fidel Castro, dethroned his rival, the pro-American dictator Fulgencio Batista, during the Cuban Revolution. It is interesting to note that while it was not until 1961 that Castro officially announced his government as communist, the Americans were well aware of his inclinations and ideologies as a sworn Marxist. This was a major and constant irritant for the United States, mainly as it saw Cuba as an ally within its immediate sphere of influence, which is also elaborated by the mutually agreed setting up of an American naval base at Guantanamo Bay. But when the Cuban regime changed hands with Fidel Castro ushering in a communist government, the Americans were suddenly forced to become a whole lot more cautious of their oceanic neighbor than ever before. Apart from being a political and strategic ally, the Americans also had diversified business interests in Cuba, like finance, railways, electricity, and sugar production that American business conglomerates majorly ran. Under Castro, when these businesses came under threat of loss and complete stoppage, worries for the Americans grew tenfold. The Bay of Pigs invasion. As a result of mounting tensions between the U.S. government and the Cuban regime, led by Fidel Castro, a battalion of 1,400 exiles, funded and armed covertly by the U.S., launched what would be a failed attempt to stamp out Castro's regime through an armed invasion on the Bahia de Cocochinos, or the Bay of Pigs, located on the southern coast of Cuba on the 17th of April, 1961. 6 months after Fidel Castro overthrew Cuba's pro-American dictator Fulgencio Batista in January 1959, the political relationship between U.S. and Cuba worsened. The new regime under Castro seized all major private establishments owned and run by American businessmen. To add to this, Castro also expanded communist influence over South America. His regime also made political and financial ties with socialist states. At the same time, he also blamed the American government for constantly working towards weakening his governance in Cuba. At the beginning of 1960, American congressmen and senators condemned Castro's allegations and regime. By June of that year, Eisenhower drafted convertible steps to curb Castro's influence in response. The CIA had since 1960 itself poised to prepare for an attack on Cuba and engaged in multiple negotiations with President Kennedy's office, after which the discussion to conduct the offensive was finally greenlit. The original invasion plan called for 2 airstrikes against Cuban air bases that were conducted by American-made bombers on the 15th of April, 1961. 2 days later, a 1,400-man invasion force disembarked under cover of darkness and launched a surprise attack. Paratroopers, dropped before the invasion, attempted to disrupt transportation and repel Cuban troops. Simultaneously, a smaller force landed on the east coast of Cuba to create confusion. Over the next 24 hours, Castro ordered roughly 20,000 troops to advance towards the beach. The Cuban Air Force continued to control the skies. As the situation grew increasingly grim, President Kennedy authorized a, quote, air umbrella at dawn on the 19th of April. 6 unmarked American fighter planes took off to help defend the brigade's B-26 aircraft flying. But the planes arrived an hour late, most likely confused by the change in time zones between Nicaragua and Cuba. The Cubans shot them down, and the invasion was crushed later that day. Some exiles escaped to sea, while the rest were killed or rounded up and imprisoned by Castro's forces. Almost 1,200 members of Brigade 2506 surrendered, and more than 100 were killed. In the aftermath of the failed mission, the CIA was blamed for poor intelligence gathering and putting Batista's men into the conflict, despite Kennedy's orders against the move. Did you know that the disaster at the Bay of Pigs had a lasting impact on the Kennedy administration? Determined to make up for the failed invasion, the administration initiated Operation Mongoose, a plan to sabotage and destabilize the Cuban government and economy, which included the possibility of even assassinating Castro. Kennedy versus Khrushchev. The Soviet Union was quick to quip Kennedy's greenlighting of the Bay of Pigs invasion as naivete and professional incompetence. President Khrushchev's criticism of Kennedy's failure added to the hostilities between the two adversaries, who also met in Vienna post the conflict to discuss this very issue. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. In the year 1962, there was another incident that added fuel to the already billowing fire of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was Khrushchev's audacious move to station missile launch pads on Cuban soil. From various perspectives, this was a balance of power move intended to regain the lost pride that the Russians had suffered during the Berlin Wall crisis. Another reason was the threat perception from American missile launch pads stationed in Turkey, which was Russia's western backyard. Simultaneously, it is on the 22nd of October, American President John F. Kennedy delivered a public address on television, exposing Soviet aggression in neighboring Cuba in a stern warning disguised as a speech. Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established that a series of offensive missile sites is being prepared on that imprisoned island. These bases' purpose can be to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature last Tuesday at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up, and having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in the fullest detail. The characteristics of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, can strike Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeast part of the United States, in Central America, or the Caribbean area. Some additional sites, which are not yet complete, appear to be designed for intermediate-range ballistic missiles, capable of traveling more than twice as far, and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson Bay, Canada, and as far south as Lima, Peru. In addition, jet bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons are now being uncrated and assembled in Cuba. At the same time, the necessary air bases are being prepared. This urgent transformation of Cuba into an essential strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all Americas, in flagrant and deliberate defiance of the Rio Pact of 1947, the traditions of this nation and hemisphere, the joint resolution of the 87th Congress, the Charter of the United Nations, and my own public warnings to the Soviets on September 4th and 13th. This action also contradicts the repeated assurances of Soviet spokesmen, both publicly and privately delivered, that the arms buildup in Cuba would retain its original defensive character, and that the Soviet Union had no need or desire to station strategic missiles on the territory of any other nation. But this secret, swift, and extraordinary buildup of communist missiles in an area well known to have a special and historical relationship with the United States and the nations of the Western Hemisphere, in violation of Soviet assurances and defiance of American and hemispheric policy. The sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which this country cannot accept if our courage and our commitments are ever to be trusted again by either friend or foe. Acting, therefore, in defense of our security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution as endorsed by the resolution of Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, a strict quarantine on all improper military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated to halt this offensive buildup. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba from whatever nation and port will be turned back if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons. If needed, this quarantine will be extended to other types of cargoes and carriers. We are not at this time, however, denying the necessities of life as the Soviets attempted to do in their Berlin blockade of 1948. Second, I have directed the continued and increased close surveillance of Cuba and its military buildup. The foreign ministers of the OAS, in their communiqué of the 6th of October, rejected secrecy on such matters in this hemisphere. Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities. I trust that in the interest of both the Cuban people and the Soviet technicians at the sites, the hazards to all concerned of continuing the threat will be recognized. Third, it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Fourth, as a necessary military precaution, I have reinforced our base at Guantanamo, evacuated today the dependents of our personnel there, and ordered additional military units to be on standby alert status. Fifth, We are calling tonight for an immediate meeting of the organ of consultation under the Organization of American States to consider this threat to hemispheric security and to invoke Articles 6 and 8 of the Rio Treaty to support all necessary action. The United Nations Charter allows for regional security arrangements, and the nations of this hemisphere decided long ago against the military presence of outside powers. Our other allies around the world have also been alerted. Sixth, under the Charter of the United Nations, we are asking tonight that an emergency meeting of the Security Council be convoked without delay to take action against this latest Soviet threat to world peace. Our resolution will call for the prompt dismantling and withdrawal of all offensive weapons in Cuba, under the supervision of UN observers before the quarantine can be lifted. Seventh and finally, I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and join in a No one in the Soviet Union could even guess how President Khrushchev would react to Kennedy's naval blockade and ultimatum. All eyes were transfixed upon what decisions would be taken at Kremlin. For the following 2 weeks, the two nations engaged in peace negotiations in a bid to avert the worst, a nuclear conflict. Soon, these two global superpowers would go through some of the tensest moments, which brought the world almost to the brink of an apocalypse. Simultaneously, open communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev prevailed, along with the open exchange of information between the two governments. Black Saturday. The 12th day of the missile crisis, the 27th of October 1962, is also known as Black Saturday. The conflict had slowly reached its penultimate stage when suddenly an incident shocked the world again. In the middle of negotiations between the two superpowers, a Soviet SM missile battery gunned down an American U-2 spy plane at the cusp of a breakthrough. This was followed by an exchange of heavy artillery fire on both sides until finally peace prevailed. But contrary to Kennedy in his speech, the Americans held back on their word of responding to even a minute Soviet offensive with overwhelming might. This is why it is said that had the Americans complied fully with Kennedy's warning, a nuclear war would have ended much of the civilized world in the wake of a Third World War. Luckily, better sense prevailed, as both superpowers acknowledged and understood the potential devastation and human cost of a nuclear war between the two, and finally reached a compromise under which the Soviet Union would disarm and destroy all of these Cuba-based ballistic missile launch pads. At the same time, the United States would follow suit with its launch pads in Turkey. Additionally, the Soviets also had the Americans pledge to never attempt an offensive on Cuba again. Finally, staying true to its word, the Soviet Union dismantled all of its Cuban missile launch pads. The world breathed a much-needed sigh of relief. Fair trade. Because of the prolonged hostilities between the two superpowers, the intertrade between the two nations had taken an enormous hit. Given the crumbling diplomatic ties followed by the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union had not traded openly. It was only in the decade between 1970 and 1980 that trade between the two grew exponentially, diffusing some of the tension that had mounted for over half a century. It would be wrong to assume that the Americans and Russians exercised the most friendly ties and relations throughout the period. However, as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the two nations agreed to stay at a safe distance from one another, a mutual decision in a healthy spirit that is followed to this day. Exploring the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, you discovered how two of the most powerful nations on Earth were drawn to a potentially destructive stalemate that could have quickly thrust the world into a Third World War. You also learned how both nations took convertible and proactive steps towards averting the end of the world and brought the situation back to normalcy through dialogue. It has been a pleasure to bring you the fascinating journey of historical events leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you liked it, please don't forget to put a rating. We'll meet you again on yet another page of history where we will unravel more facts, secrets, and international conspiracies.